Hi, I'm Lucy Caldwell, and in this short masterclass, I'd like to think a little about the second person narrator. I'd like to think in particular about intimacy, power, and the positioning of the reader in relation to the narrative. 4 of the 11 stories in my debut collection, Multitudes, and another 4 of the 11 in my forthcoming Intimacies make use of the second person narrator. I love the narrative form. I love what it can do technically. I love the space and possibilities it opens up. It's also, when done badly, the form of narrator that irritates me most. It makes my skin prickle with resentment to be told by a story, you are this, to be skewered, pinned down, to be made to inhabit a particular character. It's irrational, I know. What else is reading but slipping our own skin and trying on someone else's? But there's something about the second person narrator that can seem almost too much. It can seem confrontational, something elusive and magical, some essential connection forced. But over the 10 years of experimentation and mostly failure that it took to write the stories for my first collection and the subsequent 5 years I built on those insights for the next, I came to find a way of using the second person narrator that felt to me more intimate than almost any other narrative form. This is the moment, perhaps, for a quick flash through some examples of the second person narrator, the subtly different ways that it can and has been used in recent-ish years. It's notoriously a difficult narrative mode to sustain due to its intensity, perhaps, its claustrophobia, and it's notable that even the novels that use it successfully tend to be slim and short or fragmentary. My first encounter with the narrator, I was going to say it was with Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City, but it wasn't. It was as a child reading one of these, the Choose Your Own Adventure series, with which I was obsessed. This one is Journey Under the Sea, and this is how it begins. You are a highly experienced deep sea explorer, but your search for the lost continent of Atlantis is the trip of a lifetime. The cable attaching the seeker to the ship Murray is extended to its limit. If you decide to explore the ledge where the seeker has come to rest, turn to page 6. If you decide to cut loose and dive into the canyon in the ocean floor, turn to page 4. It suddenly strikes me as strange that the pure joy, the simple delight of role-playing as a child should feel confining as an adult reader. I also think that I would love to read a grown-up version of one of those stories I loved so much. If you could pull it off, it would be such fun, as well as potentially so moving, so tricksy, so profound. Maybe you'll be the one to do it. But back to Bright Lights, Big City. The story begins. You are not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time of the morning. But here you are, and you cannot say that the terrain is entirely familiar, though the details are fuzzy. You are at a nightclub talking to a girl with a shaved head. The club is either Heartbreak or the Lizard Lounge. All might come clear if you could just slip into the bathroom and do a little more Bolivian marching powder. Then again, it might not. A small voice inside you insists that this epidemic lack of clarity is a result of too much of that already. You are not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this. The second person narrator functions here as a form of dissociation, of disbelief. It belongs to the tiny voice inside the nameless narrator's head, the voice we all have inside our head, narrating our life, and immediately creates a tension between who the narrator is and who he thinks he is, who he thinks he is, and how far he's fallen. Already a drama. How much worse will things get before he admits to himself what he already knows? Or how long can he go on not knowing it? The night has already turned on that imperceptible pivot where 2 a.m. changes to 6 a.m., the narrative continues. You know this moment has come and gone, but you are not yet willing to concede that you have crossed the line beyond which all is gratuitous damage and the palsy of unravelled nerve endings. Somewhere back there, you could have cut your losses, but you rode past that moment on a comet trail of white powder, and now you are trying to hang on to the rush. Your brain at this moment is composed of brigades of tiny Bolivian soldiers. They are tired and muddy from their long march through the night. There are holes in their boots and they are hungry. They need to be fed. They need the Bolivian marching powder. So here, the second person narrator also allows for a level of articulacy and intelligibility that would perhaps not be available to the protagonist, at least not in his current present tense state. And a first person narrator talking in the past tense would presume a point of safety beyond this club, this downward spiral, giving the story a ready-made redemption arc that might dissipate its tension. Another, also slim, recent novella that illustrates this is Musa Okongwa's In the End, It Was All About Love. It's written in short, headed paragraphs, also present tense, following its protagonist's journey through contemporary Berlin. Here's one. Treat your loneliness as a guest. The loneliness comes about once a month, and when it does, it feels as if you've been winded by an invisible fist. It normally arrives mid-morning on a weekday, about 24 hours after you last saw or spoke to another human being. It never seems to intrude on you at an inconvenient time, not in a crowded bar of strangers, say, or just before bedtime. It always strikes you early, politely, giving you the rest of the day to deal with it. Again, in Okongwa's book, that distance from oneself, softer here, more muted. Try this. Find a second person passage and translate it into first person, into third person. Here, I think the first person would feel too confident. That nebulous edge of melancholy would be lost. The third person would treat the protagonist too much like a case study, wouldn't allow him enough space to experience the loneliness. See also this passage in his novella. You are glad you do not have a child. You couldn't imagine looking at them across the breakfast table and risking eye contact, the eye contact which, within a split second, would reveal to them the most horrifying of all truths. Daddy doesn't have a clue what he's doing. There is such a sadness to that, the sense of being disconnected from who you more truly are or would like to be, that comes in part from the degree of self-knowledge, the sense that a devastating truth is being kept just at arm's length. I find this too in two of my favourite short stories that use a second person. Laurie Moore's How to Be Another Woman from Self-Help, and David Foster Wallace's Forever Overhead from Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. The former makes brilliant use of the second person in a more imperative style tense than we've seen so far, to create and dramatise the distance between how lost its protagonist really is and the role she's trying to play, that of a glamorous mistress to a married man. It begins, meet in expensive beige raincoats on a pea-soupy night, like a detective movie. First, stand in front of Florsheim's 57th Street window, press your face close to the glass, watch the fake velvet Hummels inside revolving around the wingtips. Some white shoes, like your father wears, are propped up with garlands on a small mound of chemical snow. All the stores have closed. You can see your breath on the glass. Draw a peace sign. You are waiting for a bus. She's a young woman who isn't yet sure who she is, who is trying on new ways of being, who doesn't know herself well enough to inhabit a confident I. And in keeping with the collection's title, Self-Help, a contradiction starts to emerge between the breezy, instructive tone and the sadness, the sense of loss of self that creeps between the cracks. He calls you occasionally at the office, the story ends, to ask how you are. You always, always say, fine. And of course, we know she isn't fine. She isn't fine at all. Forever Overhead is also a coming-of-age story. Breathtakingly tender, it comes in the midst of a collection that's otherwise difficult and often even nasty. Happy birthday, it begins. Your 13th is important. Maybe your first really public day. In the story, an omniscient narrator, whose articulacy belongs far beyond a somewhat young 13-year-old boy, talks him through the day he decides he is going to jump from the highest diving board at the public pool. You have thought it over. There is the high board. They will want to leave soon. Climb out and do the thing. The imperative tense, this urging on, always seems to me to belong to the protagonist's older, future self. The narrative functions both as memory of an important day and a guide through it, through a time in a life of great, unprecedented change. And part of its tender charge comes, for me, from the overriding sense that things are going to be okay. Even when the narrative voice at the very end flips into a future tense, you will do this, you will do that, leaving us just at the moment before any of it actually happens. This is the way that I came to use the second person in many of my stories. The first person has always come far more naturally to me. Maybe it's a playwright in me, but I'm completely happy ventriloquizing, channeling, letting my characters take over, disappearing, or at least pretending that I do. And here it's worth saying, as an aside, that the narrator of a dramatic monologue will, of course, frequently address the reader as you, or at least have some degree of awareness of the audience to whom their story is directed. This is so commonplace that I won't spend any time here dwelling on it. I find the third person narrator, for many the default narrative position, to be too exposing. It always makes me feel self-conscious, make me feel too much that I'm drawing attention to myself observing and pronouncing upon my characters, brings up questions of style. This is completely irrational, I know. It's always been instinctively how I feel though. But there are times when a character, through naivety or depression perhaps, a refusal to know the deep down thing, the thing they really need to know, that means they cannot narrate in the first person. Not in the present tense, and not in a past tense either, because that presupposes a happy ending, or at least a time after all of this. And so I found a way of writing the story almost as a dialogue between the character and their future self, or between the character and that voice in their head, close and deeply intimate, and positioning the reader almost as an eavesdropper, as someone overhearing, bearing witness, but barely able to breathe for fear of disturbing a fragile, intense internal drama. The second person allowed me, as per Forever Overhead, an ineffable tenderness, a sense of a patient, amused, and greater wisdom that might not otherwise have been possible, a tone that changed and charged the stories. There are other ways of using the second person, of course, which I should touch on here briefly. Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist is narrated in the first person present tense by Sanjay, and the you directly addresses an invisible but presumed interlocutor. In John Hawke's Travesty, a self-described madman or privileged man drives a carload of people, including his daughter Chantal and her lover Henri, to their deaths, addressing them directly as he does so. And Emmanuel Carrère's This Is For You, published first in English in Granta 110 and later forming the opening of a Russian novel, had its first life in a Parisian newspaper supplement, published on the day the piece purportedly takes place. In it, the Carrère-like narrator directly addresses his girlfriend, who is meant to be on a particular train at a particular time, reading the piece in real time. In it, the narrator orders a girlfriend exactly how and where to masturbate and imagines the real trainful of watching people. It's an intensely queasy, gripping, and morally dubious admixture of the erotic and the domineering, and it perhaps says something about me that I was relieved to discover that the real-life girlfriend of Carrère chose not to get on the train that day. Finally, something I can't ignore. Coming from Northern Ireland, you also functions as a way of talking of oneself. In the infamous rugby rape trial of 2018, the defence barrister attacked the alleged victim, asking in exaggeratedly suspicious tones why she uses the impersonal you in her story. It's almost as if you're repeating something you've read rather than your personal experience, he suggested. Explaining it, the young woman said that her description of her in her statement was still trying to process what had happened when she spoke to the doctor on the day of the rape. You go into shutdown, she said. Talking about oneself in the second person is a humbling, disarming, and protective mode in a society where, when I was growing up, one of the greatest insults lobbed at you could be, "You love yourself." That could, in fact, be the engine behind young Northern Irish writer Susanna Dickey's recent debut, Tennis Lessons, a rare, long novel that manages to sustain the second person, though I would say that it's written in a series of snapshots more akin to short stories. So, there to think about: closeness and distances, power dynamics and power plays, melancholy and tenderness, degrees of love and fear, power, the positioning of the writer, the narrator, the protagonist. I hope it's given you good food for thought. Thank you.